Welcome back to those who are tuning in. I'm Clarissa Constantine, founder of the Parent Tween Connection, and I'm super excited to have none other than Martin Cinke with me today. He and I have known each other in the higher education world for 2 decades, I think. And
Around that time.
something like that. He is a veteran SAT and ACT coach, and I asked him to join us through Parent Tween Connection. He's also one of our trusted experts, which means that you know that he's reliable, safe, and pretty damn good at what he does. And so I asked him to join us to chat about this new digital SAT. It is debuting this Saturday here in the US. And by the way, if you're tuning in either through our Facebook group or our LinkedIn page, if you type in your questions, we can see them and I will field them and toss them to Marty. So first things first, let's talk about like the history of SAT ACT. Why do these tests keep changing? Because like they just changed, SAT just changed a few years ago and a few years before that or whatever. Like, what's your take on that?
Do you want the College Board response? Or
I want the
the
response
College Board
that's gonna help
response
families.
is to align more with students and what they might be doing in the future.
Okay. And so that's the party line. That's the College Board line. What is your perspective as an SAT coach or what's going to help the students? Because we know there's party line and then we know there's different interpretations.
What's going to help the student is doing their research and checking out what schools they're applying to. Are they test optional? Are they now going back to test required? Their schools are going back to test required. And that's the first thing, is just to know if you actually need to take one of these tests.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing is some of these schools that are test optional, they're very, very competitive. They're getting a lot more applicants just due to the fact that they're test optional, and a good score can help. And that's really the reason to take one of these tests, is if you are applying to a competitive school, having a good SAT or ACT score is obviously helpful. It is one of the things that the schools use in admissions, and a good score can definitely help.
So tell me your interpretation, because I hear this word, good score bandied about among high school kids who are looking to go the college route. What's your definition of a good score?
A good score, it depends on the program you're applying to. Right? Because if you're applying to Stanford, something like a 1300, well, I'm not saying that's not a good score, because it is a very good score if we're talking SAT, but unfortunately, it's not going to be competitive with, let's say, if you're applying to Stanford. You're looking at high 1400s, 1500s for a lot of these, whatever you want to call them, Ivy League schools, or kind of those upper echelon schools that are really hard to get into, or right. ACT scores of 34, 35, things like that.
Talk to me about, so you mentioned number one, having a good score. And I like the fact that we took the opportunity to reflect that that's a competitive score for the school and or program that you're applying to, that it can help on the admissions side. Talk to me about scholarships and SATs.
Yeah, so some schools do also have scholarships. So obviously, again, that's part of doing the research and seeing, and there are some scholarships that are actually tied to SAT scores or ACT scores. I don't know, like it just is what it is. It can help you get money. A good score can help you get some money too, depending on which score which school you're applying to.
Right. And I don't think that there's a family in the world, even if they are independently wealthy and could write a check for tuition, or like, I've known families that have said, I want to put tuition on a credit card so I get points, right? Like, but they're still not going to say no to free money from a scholarship.
I love free money. I love, like, free money is good. I will gladly take, if some school is offering me money, just if I have a good score on a test, sure, I'll take a look at and see if I can get a good score on a test.
Right. All right, so let's talk about the digital SAT. My understanding is, again, it debuts in the US this weekend, but it has existed internationally for some time. I know a lot of folks here in the US forget that we do bring a fair number of international students. We do attract a lot of international students. So the SAT is administered worldwide, and they've been doing the digital version for a while. Where do we start in terms of, like, what are the basics that families need to know about the digital SAT?
So first of all, the good news is there was a digital PSAT and Clarissa, we did lose you. Hopefully that is just a quick little technical glitch. The good news was there was, maybe you're completely gone. There was a digital PSAT offered to the students. Most juniors took that in the fall, which is great. So kids were exposed to it. There we go. There you are. Okay.
Back. Surprise.
Excellent. What I was saying is that most of the juniors were exposed to the digital version of the SAT with the digital PSAT. So they do have some experience there. But the biggest thing is go take a practice test. Go to download the Blue Book app and check out one of the practice tests, because it takes to check out one of the practice tests, because it does take some kind of time to kind of get used to that digital format for some students, getting used to some of the tools, getting used to the calculator that's available. Some of the kids are very familiar that I work with. There's a Desmos calculator available for the math portions. Some students I work with are very familiar with that. Some are not. You can bring your own calculator still, but kind of being used to something, getting, seeing some of the tools that you can or cannot use or what you have available is obviously, I think, very helpful.
So one of the things that I know I would struggle with is I'm very much like a paper and pencil. Like I like to put my thoughts down on paper. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the tools are? So you mentioned the Desmos calculator on the math side. What do we have on the verbal side of the house that might help the me's of the world when I'm used to writing in paper? Do they even get scratch paper?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. I was going to say that there's a good question. That was a great question for us to find
Great
out.
question.
Okay.
That's a great question. And I'm going to admit, I'm not 100% sure on the answer there.
All right. Well, you talk about the tools, and I'll go research it, and we'll find out. Thank goodness for multiple devices, right?
We will definitely find out. It's not a question that I've come across yet, and it just hadn't occurred to me to even think about it. But absolutely, it's a very, very valid, legitimate question.
Yeah.
Because most of the students, there's an annotate tool. And so most of the students I've been working with, some prefer not to annotate, which is also perfectly fine. I do think, again, annotating is helpful. But there is a tool that you can bring up, and you can write some notes on each of the questions. And good news is those notes will stay through. Even if you click on other questions, you come back to it and things like that. So I think that's, again, kind of getting used to bringing the tool up, typing some stuff in, and annotating, I think is helpful. That's one of the reasons I don't think there's scratch paper. But again, I'm not 100%.
A quick Google search actually satisfied us. They are allowed scratch paper. Who knew?
Okay. All right.
Well, then
there we go. That's good news for me. That's good news for me and you then, because I am also like you. I do like writing stuff down, but I know a ton of the students I work with are so used to just dealing with the online and bringing up the annotate tool and things like that.
Right. So tell us a bit about how this digital test works. Like, what do the students see? Like, can they move around? Like, because I know a lot of students, like, are we confined to the same section, like on the old version of the test? Like, what's it like once they actually sit down and open a section?
So you are confined to whatever section you are working on. So if you're working on the first reading section, you're confined to the first reading section. If you're working on the first math section, you're confined to the first math section. And one of the reasons for that is the SAT is now adaptive. So depending on how well you do, how many questions you get correct on the first either reading or the first math section, you're going to get a second section that is either easy or that is hard. Or kind of there's two levels to it, the hard or the easy, whatever you want to call it. But there's two possibilities that you're going to get as your second math or reading section. So you definitely have to be, based upon that, if you kind of think about it, you have to be confined to whatever section you're working on. Okay. But you can go back and forth within the section. Sorry, apologies.
Yeah, no, good. Okay, so we can move around within the particular section. And then what are the score implications? You talked about like the harder section or the easier section. In my world, that means we've got a larger portion of harder questions if we get to the harder section. But I mean, I can see in my brain going like, well, I'm just going to like make sure that I get into the easy section. Like, why would I want to make life harder for myself?
Because your score is capped if you get into the easy section, unfortunately. That's kind of the long and short of it, is you can't get your 1600 or your 1550 or your 1500 or whatever it is if you're in the easy section, unfortunately. You
Do you have
want
any
to be in
idea?
the hard section.
Has College Board been forthcoming about what that cap might be? Like if I'm like, oh, I really only want a 1200, do we know if I can get there on the easy section?
I have not done that research. I have played around with kind of the number of questions that you need to get correct to see, if you can get into the hard section versus the easy section. But I have not done that research in terms of if I just try and get into the second easy section and then I do really well, what score that would generate. I'm not 100% sure
Fair.
on.
Well, and I'm guessing that also means like if folks like you haven't got that information and you're in the space where you have to go play with it to research it, that means College Board hasn't shared much.
I mean, they're not. They don't like to share about their proprietary software. But
Sure.
if you play around with the Blue Book software, it can definitely be figured out. But really the goal for my students is to get into the second hard section. That's where you want to be. So I'm much more concerned with getting them into that second hard section than like seeing like if I could just work it so I end up with the right number of questions correct to get into the easy
Sure.
section and try and maximize that score. I mean, I'm not
Yeah.
saying that's going to be a bad score, but quite honestly, like you want to be in the hard section, you want to be able to maximize your score. You don't want to have a cap on your score.
Right. And that's at least for the kids who are looking for those really competitive scores. I mean, granted, I know that there's also the students out there who are like, you know what, I'm at a 900 or I'm at 1,000 and I don't want to go to that level of a competitive school. And so they don't need that type of a tippy top score. So
But you still want to get as many questions as you can correct and maximize your score. And I know there's probably some trepidation of being in the hard second section, but there's still questions you can find. And one of the big things about the SAT is doing the questions that you know how to do and getting them correct. So kind of this question picking, because you can go back and forth. So I can pick which questions I want to work on, and I can really make sure I answer those questions correctly. And then if I need to, I can guess on some of the other questions if I don't have time to get to my, or if I don't know what to do on a question, put an answer down and just don't spend time on it.
Oh, so there's a good tip. So if we don't know an answer, like there's not a guessing penalty. I know back in our day, there was a guessing penalty. So the advice was to leave it blank.
If depending on if you get eliminated or not, but that is back in our time. It's a conversation for another time or a back in time type of discussion. Yes. But now there's definitely no penalty. So you might as well put something down. It doesn't matter. Put B down or C down or whatever it is. Pick something. And even for the numeric entry or the questions that don't have multiple choice, they just put an answer down, put something down. So you're not going to get it correct, but put something down.
Yeah, might as well put something in and give it a try, right?
Put down the number 1, put down 2, whatever it is, put something down.
Right. So you were talking about like moving around. If I look at this question and I'm like, I don't know how to do this, or it's intimidating, or like maybe English isn't my first language and I'm looking at a reading question that just looks ginormous. That's a pretty obvious, like, okay, I'm just going to put an answer down because I don't know how to do it and no amount of time in the world is going to facilitate that. What if it's one that I get into or I look at it and I'm like, maybe, or I get into it and I feel like I'm making progress, but then I kind of feel like I'm spinning my wheels. What do I do in that situation?
That's an excellent question. And it's also one of the nice things that the SAT has is one of those tools that are there. There's this mark button. You can mark questions. You can mark the question and then you can potentially come back to it. My general recommendation is try not to get like 2 or 3 minutes in and then mark a question. It's when you kind of look at a question, kind of that decision of do I do it, do I mark it, or do I skip it? Kind of doing the test in a couple passes, like the first pass, really kind of focusing on those questions that I know how to do and making sure I get them correct, accuracy, high accuracy. And then kind of going through and looking at some of the questions that I've marked, trying to figure those out in whatever order of difficulty I want to do them in. So if you mark question 5, 7, and 13, and I mark question 5, 7, and 13, and you think 13 is easiest, you're going to go back to 13. If I think 5 is easiest, I'm going to go back to 5.
So let's actually take a minute. Can we speak to the structure of the test a little bit for folks who haven't taken it yet? I know you said go take a practice test, but when you had said like the first module, the second module, if I get into the harder second section in the reading, writing, or in the math, I've got harder questions. Do I get more time for those?
You do not. And that's where like question selection really comes into play. It's still the same amount of time that you're supposed to have. There's no extra time or anything. Oh, there you go again. Did we lose you again? Well, oops. Looks like we're having apologies, folks. Looks like Clarissa's having some technical difficulties. I don't know if one of the questions was potentially about the questions and number of questions. And there we are. There we're back.
Thanks. Sorry, the web page keeps crashing.
Okay. So yes, it's still in terms of the reading, it's still 27 questions per module, and still in the math, it's why am I drawing a blank right now?
22, I think it is, right?
22. Yes, sorry, 22. Just completely drew. Apologies, completely drew a blank right there.
Blanks allowed. So that's interesting, and that feeds into like what you're saying about, being selective about where we spend our time.
Yes, absolutely.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, if you're in the harder section, which is where you want to be, there's definitely an element of like making sure that I get the questions that I know how to do correct and potentially guessing on. There's a couple of hard questions. I feel like SAT has kind of amped up the difficulty a little bit on some of these questions. So there's definitely some hard questions when you're in the hard section. And sometimes maybe it's not just worth doing that one question. If you can get everything, if you can focus on all the other stuff, you put a guess down, maybe you get lucky, maybe you get the question correct still. But like maybe it's not worth the time investment potentially.
So I like the way that you talk about that relative to a time investment. Let's talk about that for a little bit, because so many students who are aiming for really competitive scores, like you were talking about earlier, they don't not finish tests in school.
Agreed.
Right? They're used to finishing. It's what they do. They're smart kids. They know it. And they show up to a test. They not only do they finish, but they're the first ones done in school, or one of the first ones done. And yet you just told them maybe that question isn't worth the time investment. Can you wax eloquent about that for those kids?
I can always wax eloquent, Clarissa. Absolutely. No. I mean, if I have a certain amount of time for these questions, what happens sometimes if you get bogged down on a question, this is actually, even with the high scoring students, it's very common. They have this mentality that I have to answer every single question. I have to get every single question correct. And then they get stuck on a question and they spend a lot of time on it. And then potentially if they haven't done like two or three passes through the test, they're short of time on a couple questions at the end, which potentially hurts their accuracy. And I know that these students, I don't know how you are, but I know that I am when I get a question wrong and I kind of look through it and I'm like, oh, 2 + 3, 6.
You do that too? I do that all the time.
But you know what I mean? It's like that avoidable mistake that like, what 2 + 3 is. It's not 6. But like something about whatever you were working on that question, you were rushing through it and somehow 2 + 3 became 6 because you made it 2 × 3 or whatever it was. Or you wrote 23 and it looks like the 3 looks like a 7 or whatever, like whatever it is. There's certain things that just because you're rushing, you then get the question wrong. And that to me is much more frustrating than this question that I was like, oh, I don't know. Maybe I could have figured it out. Maybe I couldn't have. And I spent too much time on it. Like in an ideal world, if I had an unlimited amount of time for this test, sure, I could figure that question out. But from a test perspective, like I don't have to actually do every single question. And sometimes skipping that one question, if that helps me get everything else correct, then I can still get my 780, my 790, whatever it is, depending on the scoring scale with skipping a question. And again, maybe I get lucky if it's a multiple choice question. Maybe I get lucky. Maybe the answer actually is B and I put B down and it is what it is.
So you talked about if it's a multiple choice. Let's talk a little bit more about the structure of some of the details, like what students are going to experience. There's the multiple choice questions, but then you also said something like the fill-ins or like the student answers. What do those look like?
It's basically there's a box and you fill in a number for whatever the answer is. So you don't have any answer choices. So you actually with the answer choices, there's certain techniques you can use to kind of help you figure out how to do those questions. There's kind of ways to do the question without potentially solving it the correct way. But for those, basically, you don't have any answer choices. It is just you got to solve the question, come up with the answer. And sometimes those are also better skip questions because you don't like if you come up and you solve an X is 30 and on a multiple choice question, 30 is not an answer, you know you've done something wrong. Whereas if it's just a numeric entry question and I come up with X equals 30 and I don't know if that's an answer or not, I'm just going to put 30 in. And I have a little bit of a check with multiple choice, but potentially kind of more likely to skip a fill in the blank or grid in, or not a grid in question, a numeric entry or a student produced responses, whatever the SAT actually calls them these days, type of question. A little bit more likely to potentially skip that type of question.
Got it. Okay, so then let's actually go back and let's talk about reading. First of all, what order do the passage or do the sections come in for a student who's never seen it? I know they've seen the PSAT theoretically, but that's been a minute. So let's just walk back through structure and what kinds of questions they're going to see.
So on the reading section, what you're going to have is you're going to have a bunch of reading comp passages. They're these kind of short passages, and they're going to then have answer choices. They do have poetry in there. I know some of my students don't like poetry. That potentially means it's a skip question or whatever it is, but you have your reading type questions. And then at the end of the reading section are actually grammar questions. So
they're
SAT
all in the same section.
Yes. So reading and writing now it's combined into one. So it's reading first, and then it's the kind of grammar slash looking at punctuation, looking at transitions, things like that in terms of grammar. That's what you're going to see. And some students like the grammar questions, which means they can actually start with them. You don't have to. You don't have to do the test in the order that they give it to you. So potentially, some students that I've worked with, I have a couple taking the test this weekend. A couple of them are actually going to be starting with the grammar questions. They're like, I'm just going to kind of skip all the reading, get to the grammar. They're very comfortable with those. They learned all their grammar and punctuation rules. And again, I'm going to preach to them accuracy over speed. Take your time, make sure you get them correct. But they can do those faster according to them. They're more comfortable with them, and then they can deal with the different types of reading questions.
So I think putting it another way is get the low-hanging fruit first.
If you like the grammar, absolutely. Again, there's some students who don't like the grammar, but you start with, again, it's the same as the math. You start with the questions you know how to do. And on the reading, if that's grammar versus the reading comp passages, then it's the grammar versus the reading comp passages.
So I guess it's get your low-hanging fruit first, whatever your preference is in both sections. Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, so quick recap. We've talked about it's now completely digitally offered. It's adaptive. You said, right? So how you do on the first section influences whether you get into the easy second, easy, hard section. There's score implications there that there's going to be a cap on the easier side. If you get into the easier section, there's a top cap, as it were. Is there, or do we think that there's kind of a bottom cap on the harder section?
Yeah, there's a floor. Yeah.
Okay. And so then we talked about some of the tools that they have. You mentioned the annotating tool that they can open it. And they can open that tool and make some notes. We talked about marking questions based on whether they think it's a question they want to come back to or worth coming back to. We talked about doing, I think of it like taking the test on your terms, finding your lower hanging fruit, as it were. I think that's a pretty big change, because I remember in my day, I just sat down and I went one through whatever the end of the section was. And because I was the rule follower, I'm sure that shocks you, right? But I did everything.
Not at all.
And I never thought to skip a question. Meanwhile, my husband, he's heard test prep over the years, and he goes, students don't know that. I was like, I didn't. He was a much more strategic test taker than I ever was. So with strategy, you've talked about, the pacing is going to be different, or the amount of time that you have in the second section doesn't change. So I'm guessing that also means that your expectation of how many you're going to finish in the second section might change. Or if they're harder questions, presumably they're going to take a little bit more time. So for our kids who think, oh, I'm going to finish.
You possibly might not. And that, again, that's
Right.
where skipping that question or two
Right.
comes in. I do work with a lot of the high scoring students. And obviously their expectation is they're still going to do it. And most of them do get through all the questions. But I think the big thing is really like that. What I keep saying, accuracy over speed, is they rush through some of those questions that are easier for them and they get them wrong. And then
Right.
they spend a lot of time on a hard question, which they potentially still get wrong.
Right.
Right. It's like there's different levels of hard questions. Like, right. There's different levels of easy questions. There's different levels of hard questions. And again, some people are more comfortable with certain types of questions. And we lost you again. Certain people are more comfortable with certain types of questions. And I don't know if the rest of the stream could still hear me. So again, doing whatever question. Oh, there we go. There we go. Doing whatever question that you are comfortable with. And again, for different students, that's different types of questions.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So then for somebody who wants to look into prep, I mean, obviously you do what you do. You've been doing it for 20 years because prep works. What are some of the things beyond this? You know, I mean, you've given some really good broad strokes. What do you do that supports a student more directly? Like what does prep look like with you or somebody like you?
Obviously, my first recommendation is practice test, see where we're at, and then see what, kind of our target score is. And then also breaking it down in terms of, is it the reading section or is it the math section, or is it certain types of questions within the reading section that are giving us trouble, or certain types of questions within the math section that are giving us trouble. So it's kind of figuring out strengths and weaknesses. Obviously, I can prep you for everything, but I've had students who come in very strong in the math and we need to just focus on the reading, or certain students who come in really strong on the grammar portion and then we need to focus more on the actual reading passages within the reading portion, things like that. So it's always kind of, let's see kind of where you're at, see where you want to be at. And then once we have that figured out, it's content and strategy for everything, anything and everything related to the SAT. I have covered some broad ideas here in terms of strategy. There's a little bit more to it than that, than we'd want to get into in the 30 minutes that we have. But big picture again is really like, which questions do I invest time in? Which ones do I not invest time in?
Sure.
And then once we do prep, obviously there's homework. Yes, I know they're not going to be happy about homework, but there's homework they got to practice. But then it's also doing more practice tests and reviewing tests together and learning from what happened on those practice tests to kind of get them to whatever score that target score is.
Right. Awesome. How can folks find you? Because my words are hard today, apparently.
I can put up I have a Yelp page. I'm also working on an updated new website, which will eventually be mctutoring.org. That should be up, let's see, hopefully by this weekend.
Nice.
Cell phone 650-704-4852. They can also email me, mmc7206@gmail.com.
Awesome. All right, Marty, thank you. Glad to have you. Good information, good insights, and good opportunity for folks to get to know you a little bit and kind of your approach to things. So for anyone tuning in, definitely reach out to Marty so that you can ask him questions about test prep and see if he's the right fit to help your student navigate this crazy world of testing for college admissions. So thanks, Marty. Appreciate your time.
No problem. Thank you.